Good evening, and welcome to Midnight History. Tonight, we open the pages of one of humanity's darkest chapters, the Black Death, between 1347 and 1351. This pandemic swept through Europe, Asia, and North Africa, leaving behind not just death, but a landscape reshaped forever. It killed rich and poor alike, toppled villages, altered economies, changed art, and scarred collective memory. Yet beyond the staggering numbers lies a deeper horror: the intimate stories of fear, cruelty, superstition, and survival. In this episode, we will walk together through 10 disturbing facts about the Black Death, truths that show how fragile life was, how strange human behavior became, and how the echoes of that time still haunt us. Now, take your place by the candlelight, and let us begin. Death on an unimaginable scale. The numbers alone defy comprehension. Between 1347 and 1351, Europe lost perhaps 1/3 to 1/2 of its people. Entire families vanished. Villages disappeared from the map. In cities, the silence was deafening. Streets, once loud with merchants and carts, stood still, littered with corpses. In Florence, the poet Giovanni Boccaccio wrote that the dead were piled like cabbages, buried in ditches, hastily covered with earth. Priests ran from their duties, and gravediggers demanded high wages because no one else dared touch the bodies. In Paris, the chronicler Jean de Venette described plague carts rattling through the streets, loaded with corpses. He spoke of funerals that blurred into one another until mourning became impossible. In London, archaeologists have uncovered plague pits, mass graves where hundreds of bodies were lowered without coffins, row upon row, wrapped in little more than shrouds. The earth itself became a ledger of catastrophe. Further east, in Cairo and Damascus, mosques overflowed with the dead. Chroniclers noted that prayers for deliverance seemed drowned by the relentless tide of loss. Some days saw thousands buried before the sun went down, and yet numbers only hint at the devastation. What made the Black Death disturbing was the way it stripped away the rituals of dying. No last rites, no proper funerals, no goodbyes. Death became anonymous, mechanical. A body was no longer a person, it was just something to be dragged to the ditch before it infected the living. Imagine the psychological toll. A city where every face might be gone tomorrow, where every knock at the door could be the messenger of plague. Europe had seen wars, famines, and invasions, but never a mortality so swift, so total, and so democratic. Kings, peasants, priests, merchants, none were spared. The Black Death was not only about numbers, it was about the collapse of meaning, and that collapse began with the silence of the grave, multiplied 10,000 times over. A disease without mercy. The Black Death was not only deadly, it was horrifying to witness. Accounts describe a sickness that struck without warning, transforming the body into a map of suffering. Victims developed swellings, buboes, in the armpits, neck, or groin. These could swell to the size of an apple, dark and painful, sometimes bursting with foul-smelling pus. Fever gripped the body. Chills racked the frame. Within days, the victim either died in agony or lingered in weakness, until death crept closer. But there were forms even worse. Some suffered the pneumonic plague, where the lungs filled with blood and fluid. Victims coughed violently, spewing infected droplets into the air. Anyone nearby could inhale death itself. In some outbreaks, entire households perished overnight. Others fell to the septicemic form, the rarest and most merciless. The blood itself turned toxic. Victims' skin darkened with blotches, black spots. The the mark that gave the plague its name. Death could come within a single day so fast that a person might go to bed healthy and be found dead at dawn. Chroniclers were not just doctors of disease, they were poets of horror. One wrote that the tongue was black, the breath foul, and no remedy availed. Another noted how parents abandoned children and children abandoned parents because the sight and stench of plague were unbearable. Medical knowledge failed utterly. Physicians tried bloodletting, herbal concoctions, even burning aromatic woods to cleanse the air. None worked. In fact, many doctors died with their patients. What made this fact so disturbing was not only the physical torment, it was the helplessness. For medieval people, illness was often a matter of balance or sin, something treatable by prayer, pilgrimage, or potions. But the Black Death shattered that framework. It mocked medicine. It mocked faith. It mocked love itself, as even the bonds of family snapped under its weight. To watch the disease unfold was to feel abandoned by physicians, by society, even by God. The Black Death was not just a sickness. It was a revelation that human beings were far more fragile than they had ever dared believe. When death has no explanation, the human mind invents one. In the 14th century, science could not explain the Black Death. So people turned their fear outward onto neighbors, onto strangers, onto those who already lived at society's margins. Rumors spread like fire. Someone must have poisoned the wells. Someone must have angered God so terribly that the punishment fell on everyone. And very often, the finger pointed toward the Jewish communities of Europe. In towns from Switzerland to Spain, whispers hardened into accusations. Stories claimed that Jews, in secret, had thrown poison into rivers and cisterns, conspiring to wipe out Christians. No evidence was ever needed. Fear was enough. Torture was applied, and confessions wrung out under agony only fanned the hysteria. The results were catastrophic. In 1348, entire Jewish quarters were destroyed. In Strasbourg, 2,000 Jews were burned alive in the public square while their neighbors watched. In Mainz, Cologne, and many other cities, communities centuries old were erased in days. But it was not only Jews. Lepers, beggars, foreigners, anyone different, anyone weak could become the scapegoat. Sometimes women accused of witchcraft were blamed for summoning the plague. Even traveling merchants faced suspicion, beaten or chased from villages because their arrival coincided with disease. The tragedy was doubled. The plague killed without mercy, and fear killed again, targeting the living. The instinct to blame did not cure a single body. It only deepened the wounds of Europe, scattering survivors, burning knowledge, and leaving scars of hatred that would echo for centuries. What makes this fact so disturbing is not only the violence itself, but its predictability. In moments of terror, societies often fracture along the old fault lines of prejudice. The Black Death reminds us that panic, left unchecked, can be deadlier than disease. In medieval Europe, death was not just an ending, it was a passage. The Church taught that a proper burial, with prayers, holy water, and consecrated ground, was essential for the soul's journey. To die without those rites was to risk wandering as a restless spirit. But the Black Death shattered this sacred order. As corpses multiplied, graveyards filled within weeks. Churchyards that once held quiet rows of headstones became mounds of tangled bodies. Priests could not keep up. They fell ill themselves, sometimes dying over the very graves they tried to bless. Desperate, cities dug mass pits, wide and deep. In London's East Smithfield, Archaeologists uncovered layers upon layers of skeletons, stacked like firewood. In Paris, the cemetery of the innocents overflowed until bones had to be shoveled into charnel houses and later into catacombs beneath the city. Worse still, some victims were buried too soon, faint from fever, mistaken for dead, awakening beneath the earth. Chroniclers whisper of muffled cries from fresh soil, of fingernails clawing wood, of silence swallowing them again. Families, once devoted to mourning rituals, abandoned loved ones at doorsteps. Neighbors hauled corpses with long poles, fearing to touch them. The bell that tolled for the dead rang so often it became background noise, a city's heartbeat replaced by the rhythm of loss. What disturbed survivors most was not only the numbers, but the loss of dignity. To be thrown into a pit without name, without prayer, was a second death. Guilt lingered, not just for the dead, but for the living who could no longer give them peace. And that guilt seeped into art, into sermons, into dreams. Europe learned that when death comes too quickly, even the rituals of faith can crumble. The Black Death did not only fill graveyards, it overflowed them. The dead outnumbered the living to such a degree that normal burial was impossible. And in that crisis, the border between the living and the dead blurred. In many cities, mass graves, so-called plague pits, were dug. Some could swallow hundreds of bodies at once. London's East Smithfield Cemetery, uncovered by archaeologists, contained layer after layer of skeletons, packed tightly, wrapped hastily in shrouds. Imagine walking through such a city. The bells toll constantly. The air smells of lime and decay. Carts roll by, heaped with corpses. In Florence, Boccaccio wrote of neighbors who abandoned bodies at their doors, waiting for officials to drag them away like garbage. And sometimes, the living were not separated from the dead at all. Reports describe victims collapsing in the streets, mistaken for corpses, and thrown into pits while still breathing faintly. Some dug their own graves, too weak to resist, and died there. Chroniclers tell of people wandering graveyards in delirium, calling out for loved ones who had already been buried. Churchyards could not contain the tide. Graves were stacked atop one another. In Paris, the ground at the Cemetery of the Innocents rose several feet as thousands were crammed into its soil. Bones would later spill into catacombs, lining walls in endless ossuaries, a physical memory of years when death ruled. This fact disturbs not only because of the horror, but because of the erosion of human dignity. To medieval Christians, burial rites were sacred, the guarantee of rest for the soul. The plague ripped that away. Funerals became anonymous. Names vanished. The living carried guilt that their dead had not been honored properly. And that guilt lingered, feeding nightmares and shaping art for generations. The plague left Europe not only with empty houses, but with landscapes literally reshaped by mass death. Hills became graveyards. Cathedrals stood over pits of bones. And in that environment, the survivors had to continue life, cooking, trading, praying, while surrounded by constant reminders that the line between themselves and the dead was terrifyingly thin. For centuries, the church had been the unshakable center of medieval life. It blessed marriages, sanctified births, and promised salvation in death. But when the Black Death arrived, faith itself seemed to falter. Priests marched bravely into sick rooms at first, clutching crucifixes, anointing the dying, but they fell in droves. Monasteries emptied, entire orders perished. Survivors began to whisper, "If God protects the faithful, why do his servants die first?" Some clung tighter to devotion, Flagellants, bands of penitents wandered town to town, whipping their own backs bloody, hoping pain might appease divine wrath. Crowds gathered, chanting hymns, believing that if enough blood was shed, heaven might show mercy. Others turned away. Church services thinned. Holy relics that once drew pilgrims gathered dust. Rumors spread that the clergy cared more for coin than for souls, selling prayers for the dead when prayers seemed powerless. The crisis revealed a dangerous thought, that the church might not hold all the answers. A seed of doubt that, in time, would blossom into the Reformation. The plague was not only a sickness of the body, it was a wound in the soul of Christendom. When fear is too large to understand, people search for someone to blame. During the Black Death, suspicion turned outward, toward neighbors, strangers, anyone who looked or prayed differently. In dozens of towns across Europe, Jewish communities became targets. Rumors spread that they had poisoned wells, that they had cursed Christian lands. None of it was true, but truth mattered little when terror demanded a scapegoat. In Strasbourg, in 1349, nearly 2,000 Jews were burned alive in a single day, their homes seized, their children scattered. Elsewhere, pogroms swept across the Rhineland, annihilating centuries-old communities overnight. Chroniclers record that even as the plague struck Jew and Christian alike, mobs refused to see the evidence. Others blamed beggars, lepers, or even foreign travelers. Fear made the familiar strange, the neighbor dangerous. In many villages, outsiders were chased into the woods, left to starve. The plague revealed a grim instinct, that in crisis, unity can collapse into violence. Not against the sickness, but against the vulnerable. And the scars of those persecutions, etched into the memory of Europe's Jews, lingered long after the pestilence itself had passed. Imagine a world where the simplest gestures, sharing bread, holding a hand, offering comfort, could mean death. The plague corroded not only bodies, but the invisible bonds between people. Neighbors bolted their doors. Parents abandoned children. Children abandoned parents. The Florentine writer Boccaccio described how mothers left their infants crying in cradles, how brothers refused to bury brothers. The instinct to care, once the glue of family and village, broke under the weight of fear. Markets emptied, inns shuttered, travelers were stoned on roads for fear they carried sickness in their breath. In some towns, guards nailed doors shut, trapping entire households inside to die together. Trust itself became a casualty. Who could you believe when doctors carried the plague as easily as patients? When priests fell as often as sinners? When even loved ones turned their eyes away? This collapse of trust did not end with the plague. It reshaped Europe's psychology for generations. The world felt less stable, less certain, more fragile, and perhaps that is the truest legacy of the Black Death. Not only graves, but the knowledge that under enough fear, the most human bonds can fracture. From the wreckage of plague, something unexpected grew. With so many dead, the old order cracked. Fields lay untilled, towns half empty, and suddenly the survivors found themselves in demand. Peasants, once bound tightly to lords, now discovered leverage. If a landlord wanted his crops harvested, he had to pay higher wages or watch his land turn to weeds. In England, laborers walked away from feudal obligations, choosing instead to hire themselves to the highest bidder. It was rebellion, slow and quiet, but real. Governments tried to push back. England's Statute of Laborers, in 1351, attempted to freeze wages at pre-plague levels, but the law was as fragile as parchment. When hands are scarce, coin grows heavy. Serfdom began to erode, village by village, contract by contract. The plague, for all its cruelty, became a grim midwife to change. Europe's social fabric, once rigid, began to loosen. In time, that shift would ripple outward, feeding peasant revolts, reshaping economies, and planting early seeds of the modern world. Out of death, strange as it sounds, came the faint pulse of new freedoms. A shadowhut WT still lingers. The Black Death ended, but it never entirely left. It haunted memory, culture, even language. Art filled with skulls and skeletons, in frescoes and carvings known as danse macabre, the dance of death. Skeletons capered beside kings and peasants alike, a reminder that no crown and no coin could buy immunity. Literature echoed the same refrain. Boccaccio's Decameron framed tales told by survivors hiding from the plague, stories woven in the shadow of mortality. Centuries later, echoes would resurface in Shakespeare, whose plays carried whispers of plague closures and the fragility of life. Even today, the Black Death shapes science. Modern epidemiology traces its roots to those desperate medieval attempts to understand contagion, and Yersinia pestis, the bacterium behind the horror, has not vanished. It still lingers in animal reservoirs, erupting occasionally in places like Madagascar or the American West. The Black Death was not only a medieval disaster, it was a turning point, one that carved mortality into Europe's imagination and left a scar across history's page. When we whisper about pandemics today, when we watch fear ripple through our own societies, we are still, in a way, living in its shadow. And so, the Black Death passes from the chronicles of the past into the shadows of our memory. It was more than a disease, it was a fracture in the story of humanity. A silence that followed bells tolling for the dead, and a reminder that even the strongest empires can tremble before what they cannot see. But history never sleeps. Its echoes reach us still in the way fear spreads, in the scars left behind, and in the questions we continue to ask about how fragile and yet how resilient we truly are. If tonight's journey through the dark corners of the Black Death gave you pause, then let it also be an invitation. Subscribe to Midnight History, where we follow the trails of forgotten mysteries, unsettling truths, and echoes from the past. Join our community in the comments, share your thoughts, and let us know what shadows of history should we explore next. Thank you for walking with us tonight through the dark corridors of history. This was Facts in the Dark, and I hope these 10 unsettling fragments of the past gave you something to ponder long after the screen fades. Until then, rest well, and remember, sometimes the past is closer than we think. Good night.